This video is about the lab report for Biology 1441 on surface area to volume ratios, thermoregulation, those topics. And so you are designing your own experiment in this lab, testing some aspect of thermoregulation and ectotherms. And then you're going to write a lab report where you describe what it was you were simulating, tie in real life examples from the literature, and explain your results and what they mean and why they're important in your discussion. Overall, we're looking for something with Times New Roman size 11 font, 1.5 spacing, no longer than 2 pages, including the figure. You should have at least one primary source, and by primary source, I mean a scientific paper. You should also cite the manual and the textbook. Under your name, you should include your lab partners' names, as well as your instructor's name. So make sure you put your instructor's name as the last name there on your list of names, and the day and time of your lab. So that'll be under your title. These reports have to be done individually. When you're writing, we prefer the third person passive voice. That's historically how scientific papers are written. So rather than saying, I added 3 milliliters of liquid to a container, you can say 3 millimeters of liquid were added to a container, for example. And follow any other instructor comments that you hear in lab. So just a reminder, the introduction of a paper is going to do just what it says. It's going to introduce the topic. Introduce the topic before you introduce your experiment. The topic. What is it you were simulating? Thermoregulation, a certain species of organism. What was it that you were simulating? So introduce the topic and give background with citations. These citations could be from the primary literature, from your textbook. They could be even from a government website or something. Don't use some blog or something. And blogs and websites do not count as primary sources, but they could count as another secondary source if you need it. Any information you get from elsewhere, you need to cite where you got it. You're going to describe what your organism was. What was the model organism, and what was it simulating? And make sure then to get your research hypothesis in that introduction as well. So you're going to explain what you think will happen and why, basically. And so an introduction starts broad and gets more specific as you get towards the end. So you start with the topic, and by the end, we know about your experiment, we know about your hypothesis. And by the way, I have examples here you can read on your own based on like a Bio 1 type experiment. Materials and methods. First of all, this is a narrative of what was done, not a recipe. Don't ever use the word you, Y-O-U, in a scientific paper, like you need to do this, you need to do that. That's a no-no. Never quote from a scientific paper. Never quote from a source in your paper. Always paraphrase in your own words. So materials and methods, you're going to explain what it was that your group did. How you set up the experiment, how far things were from light sources, so on and so forth, so someone could replicate it exactly. And you should also mention how you analyzed your data. A t-test was conducted, that sort of thing. And be sure never to use non-metric units, so always use metric system units. And you can also reference the lab manual as needed, but you do need to explain what you did in this section. Results. First of all, start by writing a paragraph of what happened. What happened? Give quantitative and qualitative data if applicable. Provide the p-value in this paragraph. Reference the figure by, don't say, as you can see in the figure. That's not how you do it. You say, the data showed a 45% increase, figure 1. In parentheses, and that's how the reader knows to see figure 1. Do not interpret the data. Don't tell me why your data happened. Just tell me what happened in this section. Make sure you have all the proper labels on your graph. Make sure you have a proper caption. This graph better be 2 columns, and that's it. Averages with error bars, a t-test. There should be no more than 2 columns on your graph. And you should include, of course, a nice caption. That'll also include your p-value, things like that. If you need to, you can shrink down the font size a little bit on the caption, if it needs it, but that's up to you. Discussion section. So once again, you're going to have your results with a written paragraph and a figure which includes a caption. Put the caption beneath the figure. Put the figure beneath the written results section. Discussion. Once again, remember before we talked about the introduction going from going from broad to specific. Well, the discussion does the opposite. It starts off with, was your hypothesis supported? And explain what happened with your data. So don't tell me what your data did again, but explain why your data happened. And you can reference the figure so folks can look back and see what it is you're talking about. Figure 1 in parentheses once again. So you're going to use concepts like surface area to volume ratio, thermoregulation, behavior, things like that to explain why your data happened. What was it that caused your data to happen? If it was an error, don't just say there were errors. If you really think there were errors, explain what they were and how they impacted your data and what you would do to improve that next time. But don't spend a lot of time on that. So then, really importantly, you got to relate your findings back to biology, and that's where you're going to cite sources. So this simulation is simulated the way that this species of lizard behaves as shown in this study, and in this study the researchers found this, which is similar to what we found, that sort of thing. You have to relate things back to biology. So in your introduction, you might want to go into why thermoregulation is important, things like that. In your discussion, you can tie back into that again. And of course, a final concluding statement. So I would recommend while you're writing this, you of course need to review Appendix B in your manual quite carefully. And also Appendix C you should look at. Appendix C shows you a rubric for the lab report. And so that is on page 117. So the last point for discussion says biological relevance is clear. So that's explaining why what you found was important, how it relates to biology. Findings are compared to what other researchers have published. And so that's what I'm looking for in your discussion section. So follow that rubric. Make a well-written document that someone who does not know about thermoregulation could pick up, and they would learn about it with your introduction. They would understand why you did your experiment. They would understand how you did your experiment. They would see what your findings were, and then they could see you make sense of those findings and tie them back to biology in your discussion. And then your citations are at the end, the last section. Once again, never quote from an author in your paper. Always put ideas into your own words, paraphrasing. If there's one author, you put their name, their last name, and the year the paper was published. If there's two authors, you do it this way. If there's three authors in the text, you would say just like Desort et al. 2020. Here's an example of a citation in a sentence. Ectotherms can control their body temperature by adjusting their posture relative to a heat source, Whitman, 1987. And then you would have to cite that in the literature cited section at the end of the paper. So you have citations in your text, and then at the end you have the lit cited section. And in that section, you always use hanging indents, and you leave the authors in the same alphabetical order that they appear on the paper. So in this case, for example, Patra M is the first author on this paper. That means they did the most work on the paper. So even though, Fowler here has a last name that starts with an F, their name's way down here. Patra is first author. And then you would organize papers in alphabetical order by the first author. So you can see that here. Allen, Andrews, Arnold, Axsmith, Bagnall, Bailey. You can see the orders of those last names by first author here. Here's an example of our old textbook. Don't cite this textbook. This is not the textbook. Actually, this is your textbook. Sorry. That's your current textbook there, how that would look cited in a literature cited section. So if you have any questions over that, please look at real scientific papers to see how their citations work and things. Don't just do things blindly. And I highly recommend that you take your rough draft to the writing center and have them help you edit it, because I will take off points for poor writing and poor grammar, things like that. So it needs to make sense. It needs to be well written, and it will be checked for plagiarism as well. So do a good job, and this is worth quite a few points. So take your time. You have 2 weeks to complete this project.